Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Caroline Hepker. Now, this general election has only got one female leader actually on the ballot, the co-leader of the Green Party, of course, and yet increasingly women hold many of the key jobs in Westminster, from the business secretary to the deputy leader to shadow chancellor. So we are spending a day every week looking at some of the women who will shape Britain as a result of this general election. Now, last week, we discussed the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves, someone who I've interviewed as a guest on this podcast. But the woman that we're focused on for this week's episode hasn't been on Bloomberg UK Politics. She has only name-checked us. In fact, she told a Spectator event that our show is apparently listened to by the people who own the country. This part of a Yes Minister gag. It got us chortling. We were pretty delighted to have been picked up by Penny Mordaunt and the crowd in Westminster. It's no secret, though, that the polls are now predicting a Conservative wipeout. Even before the election was called, though, many in the party have been thinking about who might lead their next chapter. Penny Mordaunt's name keeps surfacing, so much so that she's had to deny speculation that she's positioning for the top job, well, multiple times. Well, joining me now to discuss all of this is our associate editor, Ailbhe Ray. Ailbhe, deeply steeped in the politics of Westminster, you will have seen Penny Mordaunt's rise through the ranks, the swimsuit, the sword, the communicator. Should we start by talking about Penny Mordaunt's early life, her military roots? What's her background and how is it relevant to you, Ailbhe?
So she was born in Devon but moved to Portsmouth as a toddler. Portsmouth is sort of military and navy town, which is quite central to Penny Mordaunt's identity, as we will see throughout this episode. She was the daughter of a teacher. Her dad had been in the army and retrained as a teacher, so a military family. Her mum died of cancer when she was still at school. So there's kind of tragedy in her early life. She hasn't spoken about it that much, but we gather that she took on a kind of maternal role within her family for her twin brother and her younger brother, and had to sort of pay her way through school by working as a magician's assistant from the age of 16.
Yes, and that is sort of one of the sparkly sort of aspects of her personality that perhaps the public might recognise. But I suppose, why has she also come to prominence? I mean, I'm thinking about Splash, which was the reality TV show she did. Her appearance also at the coronation was quite significant. But she's been an MP for the whole of the duration, actually, of this Conservative government.
Even back to, I remember when Theresa May's government was on the ropes and it looked like a leadership contest would be likely. I remember back then being very interested in whether Penny Mordaunt would run for leader. She definitely considered it. She ended up, of course, not running in that contest, and Boris Johnson won. But she's just always been quite an interesting figure. I think she has a very unique personal brand. She's very articulate and has this quite unique mixture of sort of patriotism and being well-spoken and big on defense, and that brand combined with, I suppose, more progressive, socially liberal politics, which she has distanced herself from at some points of her career. When she ran for a Tory leader, she kind of changed her stance on trans rights. But for most of her time as Conservative MP and Conservative cabinet minister, she has had this kind of unique ability to kind of look both ways. And so lots of younger Tories really like her, but also I think she's recognised as a really good communicator who taps into that kind of patriotic national pride sense that also goes to the Tory core. And certainly when she ran for Conservative leader against Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss quite recently, she took a completely different approach to the two of them, where she didn't go top down from the MPs and sort of building her support there. She went directly to the grassroots. She had toured the country. She'd gone to local Conservative associations. So by the time that leadership contest was called, there were lots of local members putting pressure on their MPs to back her, with the reverse of what everyone else standing there was doing.
Yeah.
And that's really just because she does have that kind of appeal for the Tory grassroots.
Yeah, absolutely. She was also, of course, Defence Secretary, the first woman, Brexit supporter. And then, if you zoom forward more recently, she was the person who had to go out and apologise for the Prime Minister's D-Day gaffe very recently in the last few days with Rishi Sunak. But it's interesting that you talk about the interesting brand that she embodies. I want you to listen to some of the address that she gave at the Tory party conference just last year.
Stand up and fight, because when you stand up and fight, the person beside you stands up and fights. And when our party stands up and fights, the nation stands up and fights. And when our nation stands up and fights, other nations stand up and fight. And they stand up and fight for the things upon which the entire progress of humanity depends. Freedom. That is what Conservatives do.
So that was Penny Mordaunt. I mean, she was almost on the brink of tears in that address. It was also a moment of real pressure for the Conservative Party, which even all those months ago was under enormous pressure in the polls, and was she was trying to rally the MPs and the troops and the party workers for an election that was coming at some point. Now it's much closer. Ailbhe, do you think that Mordaunt is positioning herself for what might happen after the general election?
So the tricky thing is that, this series is called The Women Shaping UK Politics. And if Penny Mordaunt can hold on to her seat, then she definitely will. And she's definitely someone worth watching. And she has been someone worth watching for the past few years of Conservative politics. But the thing is that with the polls looking as they are, it seems very unlikely that she will hold on to her seat. Of all the people in cabinet, she's one of the ones most at risk. So it's possible that this will all be completely hypothetical and she just won't be able to hold on to her Portsmouth seat to be able to contest a future Tory leadership election and become the leader of the opposition. I don't think it's surprising to suggest that those would be her ambitions. She has stood for leader twice before against Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss twice. And even before that, in previous leadership contests, as I mentioned, when Boris Johnson became leader, she considered standing then. So these are clearly her ambitions. She's still quite young, so she could do it later on. But her Portsmouth seat, it would make that a challenge. That's her big Achilles heel. And people have known that in politics even before the Conservatives started really struggling in the polls. They're now 20 points behind. Even years ago, her seat was a sort of question mark about whether she would be able to stand.
Yeah, indeed. And we've sort of mentioned the issues around being tough on defence, but her sort of polished style. I mean, I was looking back at some of the clips of her in the House of Commons at the Dispatch box. I mean, she really is quite tough. And so, again, perhaps not surprising that she's been used as one of the chief communicators now in this general election campaign. She's fighting for her own seat, but she was also the one that Sunak put up for the 7 leading candidates debate, again, just in the last few days. So she was up against Angela Rayner and Nigel Farage. Have a listen to what she had to say at that, having to apologise around Rishi Sunak and what happened for the D-Day commemorations.
What happened was completely wrong, and the Prime Minister has rightly apologised for that, apologised to veterans, but also to all of us, because he was representing all of us.
So Penny Mordaunt there having to apologise sort of on behalf of the Prime Minister. She is a survivor, though, isn't she? I mean, she's managed to get through a lot of years of Tory administrations where we've seen successive Prime Ministers and a churn through of ministers.
Yes, I mean, going back to Brexit, she was in David Cameron's cabinet, or on his front bench. And then she disappointed her boss by backing Brexit for one of probably the most controversial moments of her career, because she famously went on what was then the Andrew Marr show on Sunday mornings and said that Turkey was going to join the EU and that the UK wouldn't have a veto over that. That was simply just not the case. And that angered David Cameron. It angered a lot of her own colleagues on the Tory backbenches who were supporting Remain rather than Brexit. And I think it sort of raised doubts about her relationship to the truth, a sort of rare instance where people who had liked her suddenly had doubts about her from her own side. And I think definitely it's one of the points of her career where she's faced the most criticism. And then sort of moving forward, as you mentioned, she was Defence Secretary, which was a job she loved doing, first female Defence Secretary. She didn't do it for very long, but that was a sort of a real string to her bow, a job she'd wanted to do for a long time, a very prominent cabinet position. And then more recently, she has stood for the leadership in various guises and had a recent sort of return to the spotlight in the coronation, holding that sword, which everyone thought she did very well.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the other kind of final thought, Ailbhe, then, I remember her holding the sword and her outfit. Look, what will the Conservative Party also resemble? That's a very big question, isn't it? You kind of have alluded to the fact that Penny Mordaunt kind of can face both ways. She appeals a little bit to a younger voter, but she's got the patriotism maybe of older voters. Is the party going to look like her, do you think? Or if we do end up with, the Tories out of power?
The thing is that in that Tory leadership contest against Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, Penny Mordaunt completely abandoned her previous position on trans rights. She has previously been quite supportive of trans rights. One of her brothers is queer. That's sort of a big part of her politics, or has been for a long time. But when it came to pitching herself to the Tory members, she ditched that. And the other candidates made quite a lot of hay out of it because her rivals thought that she was being quite dishonest. So I think it's just not where the Tory party is right now. Liz Truss also used to take a different position on trans rights and moved more in line with the Tory grassroots. So even if there are younger members of the Tory party who do take a different view to the National Party line, it doesn't seem like that's where the party is right now. Even more broadly, just in terms of what the Tory party looks like, that's the question for after the election that lots of Tory MPs and the grassroots are already thinking about. And I think Penny Mordaunt represents the more centrist option for a lot of people, compared with Kemi Badenoch or Suella Braverman, some of the contenders from further to the right of the party. But I suppose this is a slightly rude thing to say, but for all that we've said that she's seen as a very good communicator and she has this very unique personal brand, speaking privately to Conservative MPs, even some from her wing of the Conservative Party say that frankly she's sort of not intellectually up to the job, which is quite a rude thing to say about someone, but it's definitely a feeling in parts of the Tory party. Her campaign for leader last time fell apart quite quickly. Yeah. And I think there are doubts among her colleagues about whether she would really be up to it, even though a lot of those same people would say that she would be the perfect person to be leading them through this campaign right now because of those strengths as a communicator.
Yeah, but whether she has the gravitas and so on to kind of rally people around her is a very interesting point, isn't it? Well, I think we'll leave it there then. Talking about Penny Mordaunt, she's been an MP since 2010, of course, 51 years old. But I think fascinating just to think about the women who might be leading and in leading positions after this general election. Ailbhe, thank you so much for spending this time with me again, looking at leading female politicians. Our Associate Editor, Ailbhe Ray. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This special episode was produced by James Walcock. We will have more on the Women in Politics series next week. Our audio engineer was Meredith Frank. I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.